Haverstock Hill Murder by George R. Sims. The blinds had been down at the house in Oak Tree Road and the house shut for nearly 6 weeks. I had received a note from Dorcas saying that she was engaged on a case which would take her away for some little time, and that as Paul had not been very well lately, she had arranged that he and her mother should accompany her. She would advise me as soon as they returned. I called once at Oak Tree Road and found it was in the charge of the 2 servants and Toddlekins the bulldog. The housemaid informed me that Mrs. Dean had not written, so that she did not know where she was or when she would be back, but that letters which arrived for her were forwarded by her instructions to Mr. Jackson of Penton Street, King's Cross. Mr. Jackson, I remembered, was the ex-police sergeant who was generally employed by Dorcas when she wanted a house watched or certain inquiries made among tradespeople. I felt that it would be unfair to go to Jackson. Had Dorcas wanted me to know where she was, she would have told me in her letter. The departure had been a hurried one. I had gone to the north in connection with a business matter of my own on a Thursday evening, leaving Dorcas at Oak Tree Road, and when I returned on Monday afternoon, I found Dorcas's letter at my chambers. It was written on the Saturday, and evidently on the eve of departure. But something that Dorcas did not tell me, I learned quite accidentally from my old friend Inspector Swanage of Scotland Yard, who I met one cold February afternoon at Kempton Park steeplechases. Inspector Swanage has a greater acquaintance with the fraternity known as the Boys than any other officer. He has attended race meetings for years, and the boys always greet him respectfully, though they wish him further. Many a prettily planned coup of theirs has he nipped in the bud, and many an unsuspecting greenhorn has he saved from pillage by a timely whisper that the well-dressed young gentlemen who are putting their fivers on so merrily and coming out of the enclosure with their pockets stuffed full of banknotes are men who get their living by clever swindling and are far more dangerous than the ordinary vulgar pickpocket. On one occasion, not many years ago, I found a well-known publisher at a race meeting in earnest conversation with a beautifully dressed grey-haired sportsman. The publisher had informed me that his new acquaintance was the owner of a horse which was certain to win the next race, and that it would start at 10-1. Only in order not to shorten the price, nobody was to know the name of the horse, as the stable had 3 in the race. He had obligingly taken a fiver off the publisher to put on with his own money. I told the publisher that he was a victim of a tail pitcher, and that he would never see his fiver again. At that moment, Inspector Swanage came on the scene, and the owner of racehorses disappeared as if by magic. Swanage recognized the man instantly, and having heard my publisher's story, said, "If I have the man taken, will you prosecute?" The publisher shook his head. He didn't want to send his authors mad with delight at the idea that somebody had eventually succeeded in getting a fiver the best of him. So Inspector Swanage strolled away. Half an hour later, he came to us in the enclosure and said, "Your friend's horse doesn't run, so he's given me that fiver back again for you." And with a broad grin, he handed my friend a banknote. It was Inspector Swanage's skill and kindness on this occasion that made me always eager to have a chat with him when I saw him at a race meeting, for his conversation was always very interesting. The February afternoon had been a cold one, and soon after the commencement of racing there were signs of fog. Now, a foggy afternoon is dear to the hearts of the boys, because it conceals their operations and helps cover their retreat. As the fog came up, the inspector began to look anxious, and I went up to him. "You don't like the look of things?" I said. "No. If this gets worse, the band will begin to play. There are some very warm members here this afternoon. It was a day just like this last year that they held up a bookmaker going to the station and eased him of over £500. Oh, hello." As he uttered the exclamation, the inspector pulled out his race card and seemed to be anxiously studying it. But under his voice he said to me, "Do you see that tall man in a fur coat talking to a bookmaker? See, he's just handed him a banknote." "Where? I don't see him." "Yonder. You see that old gypsy woman with the race cards? She's just thrust her hand through the railings and offered one to the man." Yes, I see him now." "That's Flash George. I've missed him lately, and I heard he was broke, but he's in funds again, evidently, by his get-up. One of the boys? Has been, but he's been on another lay lately. He was mixed up in that big jewel case, £10,000 worth of diamonds stolen from a demi-mondaine. He got rid of some of the jewels for the thieves, but we'd never bring it home to him. But he was watched for a long time afterwards, and his game stopped. The last we heard of him, he was hard up and borrowing from some of his pals. He's gone now. I'll just go and ask the bookie what he's betting to. The inspector stepped across to the bookmaker and presently returned. He is in luck again, he said. He's put 100 ready on the favourite for this race. By the by, how's your friend Mrs. Dean getting on with her case? I confessed my ignorance as to what Dorcas was doing at the present moment. All I knew was that she was away. Oh, I thought you'd have known all about it, said the inspector. She's on the Hannaford case. What, the murder? Yes. But surely that was settled by the police. The husband was arrested immediately after the inquest. Yes, and the case against him was very strong, but we know that Dorcas Dean has been engaged by Mr. Hannaford's family, who have made up their mind that the police, firmly believing him guilty, won't look anywhere else for the murderer. Of course they are convinced of his innocence, but you must excuse me, the fog looks like thickening and may stop racing. I must go and put my men to work. Oh, one moment before you go. Why did you suddenly ask me how Mrs. Dean was getting on? Was it anything to do with Flash George that put it into your head? The inspector looked at me curiously. Yes, he said, though I didn't expect you to see the connection. It was a mere coincidence. On the night that Mrs. Hannaford was murdered, Flash George, who had been lost sight of for some time by our people, was reported to have been seen by the inspector, who was going his rounds in the neighbourhood. He was seen about 2:30 in the morning, looking rather dilapidated and seedy. When the report of the murder came in, the inspector at once remembered that he'd seen Flash George in Haverstock Hill, but there was nothing in it, as the house hadn't been broken into and there was nothing stolen. You understand now why seeing Flash George carried my train of thought onto the Hannaford murder and Dorcas Dean. Goodbye now. The inspector hurried away, and a few minutes afterwards the favourite came in alone for the second race on the card. The stewards immediately afterwards announced that racing would be abandoned on the account of the fog increasing, and I made my way to the railway station and went home by the members' train. Directly I reached home, I turned eagerly to my newspaper file and read up on the Hannaford murder. I knew the leading features, but every detail of it now had special interest to me, seeing that Dorcas had taken the case up. These were the facts as reported in the press. Early in the morning of January 5th, a maid-servant rushed out of the house, standing in its own grounds on Haverstock Hill, calling "Murder!" Several people who were passing instantly came to her and inquired what was the matter, but all she could gasp was, "Fetch a policeman!" When the policeman arrived, he followed the terrified girl into the house and was conducted to the drawing-room, where he found a lady lying in a nightdress in the centre of the room, covered with blood, but still alive. He sent one of the servants for a doctor and another to the police station to inform the superintendent. The doctor came immediately and declared that the woman was dying. He did everything that could be done for her, and presently she partially regained consciousness. The superintendent had by this time arrived, and in the presence of the doctor asked her who had injured her. She seemed anxious to say something, but the effort was too much for her, and presently she relapsed into unconsciousness, and she died 2 hours later without speaking. The woman's injuries had been inflicted with some heavy instrument. On making a search of the room, the poker was found lying between the fireplace and the body. The poker was found to have blood upon it, and some hairs from the unfortunate lady's head. The servants stated that their master and mistress, Mr. and Mrs. Hannaford, had retired to rest at their usual time, shortly before midnight. The housemaid had seen them go up together. She had been working at a dress which she wanted for the next Sunday and sat up late using her sewing machine in the kitchen. It was 1:00 in the morning when she passed her master and mistress's door, and she judged by what she heard that they were quarrelling. Mr. Hannaford was not in the house when the murder was discovered. The house was searched thoroughly and in every direction, the first idea of the police being that he had committed suicide. The telegraph was then set to work, and at 10 o'clock a man answering to Mr. Hannaford's description was arrested at Paddington Station, where he was taking a ticket for Uxbridge. Taken to the police station and informed that he would be charged with murdering his wife, he appeared to be horrified, and for some time was a prey to a most violent emotion. When he had recovered himself and was made aware of the serious position in which he stood, he volunteered a statement. He was warned, but he insisted on making it. He declared that he and his wife had quarrelled violently after they had retired to rest. Their quarrel was about purely a domestic matter, but he was in an irritable, nervous condition owing to his health, and at last he had worked himself up into such a state that he had risen, dressed himself, and gone out into the street. That would be about 2 a.m. He had wandered about in a state of nervous excitement until daybreak. At 7 he had gone into a coffee house and had breakfast, and had then gone into the park, and had sat on a seat and fallen asleep. When he woke up it was 9 o'clock, and had taken a cab to Paddington, and had intended to go to Uxbridge to see his mother, who resided there. Quarrels between himself and his wife had been frequent of late, and he was ill and wanted to get away, and he thought perhaps if he went to his mother's for a day or two, he might get calmer and feel better. He had been very much worried lately over business matters. He was a stock jobber, and the market in securities in which he had been speculating was against him. At the conclusion of the statement, which was made in a nervous, excited manner, he broke down so completely that it was deemed desirable to send the doctor and keep him under close observation. Police investigation of the premises failed to find any further clue. Everything pointed to the supposition that the result of the quarrel had been an attack by the husband, possibly in a sudden fit of homicidal mania, on the unfortunate woman. The police suggestion was that the lady, terrified by her husband's behaviour, had risen in the night and run down the stairs to the drawing-room, and that he had followed her there, picked up the poker, and furiously attacked her. When she fell, apparently lifeless, he had run back to his bedroom, dressed himself, and made his escape quietly from the house. There was nothing missing so far as could be ascertained, nothing to suggest in any way that any third party, a burglar from the outside or some person inside, had had anything to do with the matter. The coroner's jury brought in a verdict of wilful murder, and the husband was charged before a magistrate and committed for trial. But in the interval his reason gave way, and the doctors certifying that he was undoubtedly insane, he was sent to Broadmoor. Nobody had the slightest doubt of his guilt, and it was his mother who, broken-hearted and absolutely refusing to believe her son's guilt, had come to Dorcas Dean and requested her to take up the case privately and investigate it. The poor old lady declared that she was perfectly certain that her son could not have been guilty of such a deed, but the police were satisfied and that they would make no further investigation. This I learnt afterwards, when I went to see Inspector Swanage. All I knew, when I had finished reading up on the case in the newspapers, was that the husband of Mrs. Hannaford was in Broadmoor, practically condemned for the murder of his wife, and that Dorcas Dean had left home to try and prove his innocence. The history of the Hannafords, as given in public press, was as follows. Mrs. Hannaford was a widow when Mr. Hannaford, a man of 36, married her. Her first husband was a Mr. Charles Drayson, a financier, who had been among the victims of the fire at the Paris Opera Comique. His wife was with him in the lodge when that fatal night when the fire broke out, and they both tried to escape together. They became separated in the crush. She was only slightly injured and succeeded in getting out. He was less fortunate. His gold watch, a presentation one, with an inscription, was found among a mass of charred, unrecognizable remains when the ruins were searched. 3 years after this tragedy, the widow married Mr. Hannaford. The death of her first husband did not leave her well off. It was found that he was heavily in debt, and had he lived, a serious charge of fraud would undoubtedly have been preferred against him. As it was, his partner, and Mr. Thomas Holmes, was arrested and sentenced to 5 years' penal servitude in connection with a joint fraudulent transaction. The estate of Mr. Drayson went to satisfy the creditors, but Mrs. Drayson, the widow, retained the house at Haverstock Hill, which he had purchased and settled on her, with all the furniture and contents some years previously. She wished to continue living in the house when she married again, and Mr. Hannaford consented, and they made it their home. Hannaford himself, though not a wealthy man, was a fairly successful stock jobber, and until the crisis, which had brought on great anxiety and helped to break down his health, had had no financial worries. But the marriage, so it was alleged, had not been a very happy one, and quarrels had been frequent. Old Mrs. Hannaford was against it from the first, and to her son always turned in his later matrimonial troubles. Now that his life had probably been spared by this mental breakdown, and he had been sent to Broadmoor, she had but one object in life, to set her son free, some day restored to reason, and with his innocence proved to the world. It was about a fortnight after my interview with Inspector Swanage and my study of the details of the Haverstock Hill murder that one morning I opened a telegram and to my intense delight found that it was from Dorcas Dean. It was from London, and informed me in the evening they would be very pleased to see me at Oak Tree Road. In the evening I presented myself about 8 o'clock, and Paul was alone in the drawing-room when I entered, but his face and his voice when he greeted me showed plainly that he had benefited greatly by the change. "Where have you been to look so well?" I asked. "The south of Europe, I suppose? Nice or Monte Carlo?" "No," said Paul, smiling. "We haven't been nearly so far as that. But I mustn't tell tales out of school. You must ask Dorcas." And at that moment Dorcas came in and gave me a cordial greeting. "Well," I said after the first conversational preliminaries, "who committed the Haverstock Hill murder?" "Oh, so you know that I have taken that up, do you? I imagined it would get about through the yard people. You see, Paul dear, how wise I was to give out that I had gone away." "Give out!" I exclaimed. "You haven't been away, then?" "No. Paul and Mother have been staying at Hastings. I have been down whenever I have been able to spare a day, but as a matter of fact, I have been in London the greater part of the time." "But I don't see the use of you pretending you were away." "I did it on purpose. I knew the fact that old Mrs. Hannaford had engaged me would get about in certain circles, and I wanted certain people to think that I had gone away to investigate some clue which I thought I had discovered. In order to balk all possible inquiries, I didn't even let the servants forward my letters. They went to Jackson, who sent them on to me." "Then you were really investigating in London?" "Now shall I tell you where you heard that I was on the case?" "Yes. You heard it at Kempton Park steeplechases, and your informant was Inspector Swanage." "You have seen him and he has told you?" "No. I saw you there talking to him." "You saw me? You were at Kempton Park? I never saw you." "Yes, you did, for I caught you looking full at me. I was trying to sell some race cards just before the second race, and was holding them between the railings of the enclosure." "What? You were the gypsy woman? I'm certain Swanage didn't know you." "I didn't want him to, or anybody else." "It was an astonishing disguise. But come, aren't you going to tell me anything about the Hannaford case? I've been reading up on it, but I fail entirely to see the slightest suspicion against anyone but the husband. Everything points to his having committed the crime in a moment of madness. The fact that he has since gone completely out of his mind seems to me to show that conclusively." "It is a good job he did go out of his mind, for I am afraid he would have suffered for the crime, and the poor broken-hearted old mother for whom I was working would soon have followed him into the grave." "Then you don't share general belief in his guilt?" "I did at first, but I don't now." "You have discovered the guilty party?" "No, not yet, but I hope to." "Tell me exactly all that has happened. There may still be a chance for your assistant." "Yes, it's quite possible now I may be able to avail myself of your services. You say that you have studied the details of this case. Let us just run through them together and see what you think of my plan of campaign so far as it has gone. When old Mrs. Hannaford came to me, her son had already been declared insane and unable to plead, and had gone to Broadmoor. That was nearly a month after the commission of the crime, so that much valuable time had been lost. At first I declined to take the matter up. The police had so thoroughly investigated the affair. The case seemed so absolutely conclusive that I told her that it would be useless for her to incur the heavy expense of a private investigation. But she pleaded so earnestly. Her faith in her son was so great, and she seemed such a sweet, dear old lady, that at last she conquered my scruples, and I consented to study the case and see if there was the slightest alternative theory to go on. I had almost abandoned hope, for there was nothing in the published reports to encourage it, when I determined to go to the fountainhead and see the superintendent who had had the case in hand. He received me courteously and told me everything. He was certain that the husband committed the murder. There was an entire absence of motive for anyone else in the house to have done it, and the husband's flight from the house in the middle of the night was absolutely damning. I inquired if they had found anyone who had seen the husband in the street, anyone who could fix the time at which he had left the house. He replied that no such witness had been found. Then I asked if the policeman on duty that night had made any report of any suspicious characters being seen about. He said no. The only person he had noticed at all was a man well known to the police, a man named Flash George. I asked what time Flash George had been seen and whereabouts, and I ascertained that it was at 2:30 in the morning, and about 100 yards below the scene of the crime. That's when the policeman spoke to him. He said that he was coming from Hampstead, and he was going to Covent Garden Market. He walked away in the direction of the Chalk Farm Road. I inquired what Flash George's record was, and I ascertained that he was the associate of thieves and swindlers, and he was suspected of having disposed of some jewels, the proceeds of a robbery which had been made a 9 days sensation. But the police had failed to bring the charge home to him, and the jewels were never traced. He was also a gambler, and frequented of racecourses at certain nightclubs of evil repute, and had not been seen about for some time previous to that evening. And didn't the police make any further investigations in that direction? No. Why should they? There was nothing missing from the house, not the slightest sign of an attempted burglary. All their efforts were directed at proving the guilt of the unfortunate woman's husband. And you? I had a different task. Mine was to prove the husband's innocence. I determined to find out something more of Flash George. I shut the house up, gave out that I had gone away, and took, amongst other things, to selling cards and pencils on racecourses. The day that Flash George made his reappearance on the turf after a long absence was the day he backed a winner of the second race at Kempton for £100. But surely that proves that if he had been connected with any crime, it must have been one in which money was obtained. No one has attempted to associate the murder of Mrs. Hannaford with robbery. No, but one thing is certain. On that night of the crime, Flash George was in the neighbourhood. 2 days previously, he had borrowed a few pounds of a pal because he was stony broke. When he reappears as a racing man, he has on a fur coat, is evidently in first-class circumstances, and he bets in £100 notes. He is considerably richer man after the murder of Mrs. Hannaford than he was before, and he was seen within 100 yards of the house at 2:30 on the night that the crime was committed. That might have been a mere accident. His sudden wealth may be the result of a lucky gamble, or a swindle of which you know nothing. I can't see that it can possibly have any bearing on the Hannaford crime, because nothing was taken from the house. Quite true, but here is a remarkable fact. When he went up to the betting man, he went to one who was betting close to the rails, and I pushed my cards in between and asked him to buy one. Flash George is a suspected character and quite capable on a foggy day of trying to swindle a bookmaker. The bookmaker took the precaution to open that note, it being for £100, and examined it carefully. That enabled me to see the number. I had sharpened pencils to sell, and with one of them I hastily took down the number of that note, 35421. That was clever. Have you traced it? Yes. And has it furnished you with any clue? It has placed me in possession of a most remarkable fact. The £100 note, which was in Flash George's possession on Kempton Park Racecourse, was one of a number which were paid over the counter of the Union Bank of London for a £5,000 cheque over 7 years ago, and that cheque was drawn by the murdered woman's husband. Mr. Hannaford? No, her first husband, Mr. Charles Drayson. When Dorcas Dean told me that the £100 note Flash George had handed to the bookmaker at Kempton Park was one which had some years previously been paid to Mr. Charles Drayson, the first husband of the murdered woman, Mrs. Hannaford, I had to sit still and think for a moment. It was curious, certainly, but after all, much more remarkable coincidences than that occurred daily. I could not see what practical value there was in Dorcas's extraordinary discovery, because Mr. Charles Drayson was dead, and it was hardly likely that his wife would have kept a £100 note of his for several years. And if she had not been murdered for that, because there were no signs of the house having been broken into. The more I thought the business over, the more confused I became in my attempt to establish a clue from it, and so after a minute's silence I frankly confessed to Dorcas that I didn't see where her discovery led to. I don't say that it leads very far by itself, said Dorcas, but you must look at all the circumstances. During the night of January 5th, a lady is murdered in her own drawing-room, round about the time that the attack is supposed to have been made upon her. A well-known bad character is seen close to the house. That person, who just previously has been ascertained to have been so hard up that he had been borrowing of his associates, reappears on the turf a few weeks later, expensively dressed and in possession of money. He bets with a £100 note, and that £100 note I have traced to the previous possession of the murdered woman's first husband, who lost his life at the Opera Comique disaster in Paris while on a short visit to that capital. Yes, it certainly is curious, but wait a minute, I haven't finished yet. Of the banknotes, several of them for £100, which were paid some years ago to Mr. Charles Drayson, not one had come back before the murder. Indeed. Since the murder, several of them have come in. Now, is it not a remarkable circumstance that during all those years £5,000 worth of banknotes should have remained out? It is remarkable, but after all, banknotes circulate. They may pass through hundreds of hands before returning to the bank. Some may, undoubtedly, but it's highly improbable that all would under ordinary circumstances, especially notes for £100. These are sums which are not passed from pocket to pocket. As a rule, they go to the bank of one of the early receivers of them, and from that bank into the Bank of England. You mean that it is an extraordinary fact that for many years not one of the notes paid to Mr. Charles Drayson by the Union Bank came back to the Bank of England? Yes, that is an extraordinary fact. But there is a fact which is more extraordinary still, and that is that soon after the murder of Mrs. Hannaford, that state of things ceases. It looks as though the murderer had placed the notes in circulation again. It does, certainly. Have you traced back any of the other notes that have come in? Yes, but they have been cleverly worked. They have nearly all been circulated in the betting ring. Those that have not have come in from money changers in Paris and Rotterdam. My own belief is that before long the whole of those notes will come back to the bank. Then, my dear Dorcas, it seems to me that your course is plain. You ought to go to the police and get them to the bank to circulate the list of notes. Dorcas shook her head. No, thank you, she said. I'm going to carry this case through on my own account. The police are convinced that the murderer is Mr. Hannaford, who is at present in Broadmoor, and the bank has absolutely no reason to interfere. No question has been raised of the notes having been stolen. They were paid to the man who died over 7 years ago, and not the woman who was murdered last January. But you have traced one note to Flash George, who's a bad lot, and if he was near the house on the night of the tragedy, you suspect Flash George, and I do not suspect Flash George of the actual murder, she said. and I don't see how he is to be arrested for being in possession of a banknote which forms no part of the police case, and which he might easily say he had received in the betting ring. Then what are you going to do? Follow up the clue I have. I have been shadowing Flash George all the time I have been away. I know where he lives. I know who are his companions. And you think the murderer is among them? No. They are all a little astonished at his sudden good fortune. I have heard them chip him, as they call it, on the subject. I've carried my investigations up to a certain point, and there they stop short. I'm going a step further tomorrow evening, and it is in that step I want assistance. You have come to me? I said eagerly. Yes. What do you want me to do? Tomorrow morning I'm going to make a thorough examination of the room in which the murder was committed. Tomorrow evening I have to meet a gentleman of whom I know nothing but his career and his name, and I want you to accompany me. Certainly, but if I am to be your assistant in the evening, I shall expect to be your assistant in the morning. I should very much like to see the scene of the crime. I have no objection. The house on Haverstock Hill is at present shut up and in the charge of a caretaker, but the solicitors who are managing the late Mrs. Hannaford's estate have given me permission to go over it and examine it. The next day at 11 o'clock I met Dorcas outside Mrs. Hannaford's house, and the caretaker who had received his instructions admitted us. He was the gardener and an old servant, and had been present during the police investigation. In the bedroom, in which Mr. Hannaford and his wife slept on the fateful night, was on the floor above. Dorcas told me to go upstairs, shut the door, lie down on the bed, and listen. Directly a noise in the room attracted my attention, I was to jump up, open the door, and call out. I obeyed her instructions and listened intently, but lying on the bed I heard nothing for a long time. It must have been quite a quarter of an hour when suddenly I heard the sound as of a door opening with a crackling sound. I leapt up, ran to the balusters, called over, "I heard that!" "All right, then. Come down," said Dorcas, who was standing in the hall with the caretaker. She explained to me that she had been moving about the drawing room with the man, and they had both made as much noise with their feet as they could. They had even opened and shut the drawing room door, but nothing had attracted my attention. Then Dorcas had sent the man to open the front door. It had opened with the crackling sound that I had heard. "Now," said Dorcas to the caretaker, "you were here when the police were coming and going. Did the front door always make a sound like that?" "Yes, madam. The door had swollen or warped or something, and it was always difficult to open. Mrs. Hannaford spoke about it once and was going to have it eased." "That's it then," said Dorcas to me. "The probability is that it was the noise made by the opening of that front door which first attracted the attention of the murdered woman." "That was Hannaford going out, if the story is correct?" "No, Hannaford went out in a rage. He would pull the door open violently and probably bang it too. That she would understand. It was when the door opened again with a sharp crack that she listened, thinking that her husband had come back." "But she was murdered in the drawing room." "Yes. My theory, therefore, is that after the opening of the front door, she had expected her husband to come upstairs. He didn't do so, and she concluded that he had gone into one of the rooms downstairs to spend the night, and she got up and came down to find him and ask him to get over his temper and come back to bed. She went into the drawing room to see if he was there, and was struck down from behind before she had time to utter a cry. The servants heard nothing, remember?" "They said so at the inquest, yes." "Now, come into the drawing room. This is where the caretaker tells me the body was found, here in the centre of the room. The poker with which the fatal blow had been struck was lying between the body and the fireplace. The absence of a cry and the position of the body show that when Mrs. Hannaford opened the door, she saw no one. I am, of course, presuming that the murderer was not her husband, and she came in further. But there must have been someone in the room, or she couldn't have been murdered in it." "That's indisputable. But he might not have been in the room at the time. The person might have been hiding in the hall and followed her in. To suppose that, we must presume that the murderer came into the room, took the poker from the fireplace, and went out again in order to come in again. That poker was secured, I'm convinced, when the intruder heard footsteps coming down the stairs. He picked up the poker, then concealed himself here. Then why, my dear Dorcas, shouldn't he have remained concealed until Mrs. Hannaford had gone out of the room again? I think she was turning to go when he rushed out and struck her down. He probably thought that she had heard the noise of the door and might go and alarm the servants. But just now you said she came in believing that her husband had returned and was in one of the rooms. The intruder could hardly be in possession of her thoughts. In the meantime, he could have got out the front door. Yes, but if his object was robbery, he would have had to go without the plunder. He struck the woman down in order to have time to get what he wanted. Then you think he left her here senseless while he searched the house? Nobody's got anything by searching the house, ma'am, broke in the caretaker. The police satisfied themselves that nothing had been disturbed. Every door was locked. The plate was all complete. Not a bit of jewellery or anything was missing. The servants were all examined about that, and the detectives went over every room and every cupboard to prove it wasn't no burglar broke in or any of that sort. Besides, the windows were all fastened. What he says is quite true, said Dorcas to me, but something alarmed Mrs. Hannaford in the night and brought her to the drawing-room in her nightdress. If it was, as I suspect, the opening of the front door, that is how the guilty person got in. The caretaker shook his head. It was a poor master that did it, ma'am, right enough. He was out of his mind. Dorcas shrugged her shoulders. If he had done it, it would have been a furious attack. There would have been oaths and cries, and the poor lady would have received a rain of blows. The medical evidence shows that death was from one heavy blow on the back of the skull. But let us see where the murderer could have concealed himself, ready armed, with the poker here in the drawing-room. In front of the drawing-room window were heavy curtains, and I at once suggested that curtains were the usual place of concealment on stage and might be in real life. As soon as I had asked the question, Dorcas turned to the caretaker. Are you certain that every article of furniture is in its place exactly as it was that night? Yes. The police prepared a plan of the room for the trial, and since then, by the solicitor's orders, we've not touched a thing. That settles the curtains, then, continued Dorcas. Look at the windows for yourself. In front of one, close by the curtains, is an ornamental table covered with china and glass and bric-a-brac, and in front of the other a large settee. No man could have come from behind those curtains without shifting that furniture out of the way. That would have immediately attracted Mrs. Hannaford's attention and given her time to scream and to rush out of the room. No, we must find another place for the assassin. I wonder if... Dorcas's eyes fixed on a large brown bear which stood nearly against the wall near the fireplace. The bear, a very fine, big specimen, was supported in its upright position by an ornamental iron pole, at the top of which was fixed an oil lamp covered with a yellow silk shade. That is a fine bear lamp, exclaimed Dorcas. Yes, said the caretaker. It's been here ever since I've been in the family service. It was bought by the poor mistress's first husband, Mr. Drayson, and he thought a lot of it. But, he added, looking at it curiously, I always thought it stood closer to the wall than that. It used to, right against it. Ah, exclaimed Dorcas, that's interesting. Pull the curtains right back and give me all the light you can. As the man obeyed her direction, she went down on her hands and knees and examined the carpet carefully. You are right, she said. This has been moved a little forward and not so very long ago. The carpet, for a square of some inches, is a different colour to the rest. The brown bear stands on a square mahogany stand, and the exact square now shows the colour of the carpet that has been hidden by it. Only here is a discoloured portion, and the bear does not now stand on it. The evidence of the bear having been moved forward from a position it had long occupied was indisputable. Dorcas got up and went to the door of the drawing-room. Go and stand behind that bear, she said. Stand as compact as you can, as though you were endeavouring to conceal yourself. I obeyed, and Dorcas, standing in the drawing-room doorway, declared that I was completely hidden. Now, she said, coming to the centre of the room and turning her back to me, reach down from where you are and see if you can pick up the shovel from the fireplace without making a noise. I reached out carefully, and I had the shovel in my hand without making a sound. I have it, I said. That's right. The poker would have been on the same side as the shovel, and much easier to pick up quietly. Now, while my back is turned, grasp the shovel by the handle, leap out at me, and raise the shovel as if to hit me. But don't get too excited and do it, because I don't want to realize that scene too completely. I obeyed. My footsteps were scarcely heard on the heavy piled drawing-room carpet. When Dorcas turned round, the shovel was above her head, ready to strike. Thank you for letting me off, she said with a smile. Then, her face becoming serious again, she exclaimed, The murderer of Mrs. Hannaford concealed himself behind that brown bear lamp and attacked her in exactly the way I have indicated. But why had he moved the bear 2 or 3 inches forward? To conceal himself behind it. Nonsense! His concealment was a sudden act. That bear is heavy. The glass chimney of the lamp would have rattled as if it had been done violently and hurriedly while Mrs. Hannaford was coming downstairs. That would have attracted her attention, and she would have called out, Who's there? At the doorway, and not have come in looking for her husband. Dorcas looked at the animal over carefully, prodded it with her fingers, and then went behind it. After a minute or 2 of close examination, she uttered a little cry and called me to her side. She had found in the back of the bear a small straight slit. This was quite invisible. She had only discovered it by an accidentally violent thrust of her fingers into the animal's fur. Into this slit she thrust her hand, and the aperture yielded sufficiently for her to thrust her arm in. The interior of the bear was hollow, but Dorcas's hand, as it went down, struck against a wooden bottom. Then she withdrew her arm, and the aperture closed up. It had evidently been specially prepared as a place of concealment, and only the most careful examination would have revealed it. Now, exclaimed Dorcas triumphantly, I think we are on the straight road. This, I believe, is where those missing banknotes lay concealed for years. They were probably placed there by Mr. Drayson, with the idea that someday his funds might be discovered, or he might be made a bankrupt. This was his little nest egg, and his death in Paris before his fraud was discovered prevented his making use of them. Mrs. Hannaford evidently knew nothing of the hidden treasure, or she would speedily have removed it. But someone knew, and that someone put his knowledge to practical use the night that Mrs. Hannaford was murdered. The man who got in at the front door that night got in to relieve the bear of its valuable stuffing. He moved the bear to get at the aperture and was behind it when Mrs. Hannaford came in. The rest is easy to understand. But how did he get in at the front door? That's what I have to find out. I am sure now that Flash George was in it. He was seen outside, and some of the notes that were concealed in the brown bear lamp have been traced to him. Who was Flash George's accomplice we may discover tonight? I think I have an idea, and if it is correct, we shall have the solution of the whole mystery before dawn tomorrow morning. Why do you think you'll learn so much tonight? Because Flash George met a man 2 nights ago outside the Criterion. I was selling wax matches and followed them up, pestering them. I heard George say to his companion, who I had never seen with him before, Tell him Hungerford Bridge, midnight Wednesday. Tell him to bring the lot and I'll cash up for them. And you think the him is the man who rifled the brown bear and killed Mrs. Hannaford? At 11 o'clock that evening, I met Dorcas Dean in Villiers Street. I knew what she would be like, otherwise her disguise would have completely baffled me. She was dressed as an Italian street musician, and was with a man who looked like an Italian organ grinder. Dorcas took my breath away with her first words. Allow me to introduce you, she said, to Mr. Thomas Holmes, This is the gentleman who was Charles Drayson's partner and was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude over the partnership frauds. Yes, replied the organ grinder in excellent English. I suppose I deserved it for being a fool. But the villain was Drayson. He had all my money and involved me in a fraud at the finish. I have told Mr. Holmes the story of our discovery, said Dorcas. I have been in communication with him ever since I discovered the notes were in circulation. He knew Drayson's affairs and has given me some valuable information. He is with us tonight because he knows Mr. Drayton's former associates, and he may be able to identify the man who knew the secret of the house at Haverstock Hill. You think that is the man that Flash George is to meet? I do. What else can tell him to bring the lot, and I'll cash up mean, but the rest of the banknotes. Shortly before 12, we got onto Hungerford Bridge, the narrow footway that runs across the Thames by the side of the railway. I was to walk ahead and keep clear of the Italians until I heard a signal. We crossed the bridge after that once or twice, I coming from one end and the Italians from the other, and passing each other about the centre. At 5 minutes to midnight, I saw Flash George come slowly along from the Middlesex side. The Italians were not far behind. A minute later, an old man with a grey beard and wearing an old Inverness cape passed me, coming from the Surrey side. When he met Flash George, the two stopped and leant over the parapet, apparently interested in the river. Suddenly I heard Dorcas's signal. She began to sing the Italian song Santa Lucia. I had my instructions. I jostled up against the two men and begged their pardon. Flash George turned fiercely around. At the same moment I seized the old man and shouted for help. The Italians came hastily up. Several foot passengers rushed to the scene and inquired what was the matter. He was going to commit suicide, I cried. He was just going to jump into the water. The old man was struggling in my grasp. The crowd were keeping back Flash George. They believed the old man was struggling to get free to throw himself into the water. The Italian rushed up to me. Ah, poor man, he said. Don't let him get away. He gave a violent tug to the grey beard and it came off in his hands. And then with an oath he seized the supposed would-be suicide by the throat. You infernal villain, he said. Who is he? Asked Dorcas. Who is he? Exclaimed Thomas Holmes. Why, the villain who brought me to ruin, my precious partner, Charles Drayson. As the words escaped from the supposed Italian's lips, Charles Drayson gave a cry of terror and, leaping onto the parapet, plunged into the river. Flash George turned to run, but was stopped by a policeman who had just come up. Dorcas whispered something in the man's ear, and the officer, thrusting his hand into the rascal's pocket, drew out a bundle of banknotes. A few minutes later, the would-be suicide was brought ashore. He was still alive, but had injured himself terribly in his fall and was taken to hospital. Before he died, he was induced to confess that he had taken advantage of the Paris fire to disappear. He had flung his watch down in order that it might be found as evidence of his death. He had, previously to visiting the Opera Comique, received a letter at his hotel, which told him pretty plainly that the game was up, and he knew that at any moment a warrant might be issued against him. After reading his name amongst the victims, he lived as best he could abroad, but after some years being in desperate straits, he determined to do a bold thing, return to London and endeavour to get into his house and obtain possession of the money which was lying unsuspected in the interior of the Brown Bear lamp. He had concealed it, well knowing that at any time the crash might come and everything belonging to him seized. The hiding place he had selected was one which neither his creditors nor his relatives would suspect. On the night he entered the house, Flash George, whose acquaintance he had made in London, kept watch for him while he let himself in with his latch-key, which he had carefully preserved. Mr. Hannaford's leaving the house was one of those pieces of good fortune which occasionally favour the wicked. With his dying breath, Charles Drayson declared that he had no intention of killing his wife. He feared that, having heard a noise, she had come to see what it was, and might alarm the house in her terror. As she turned to go out of the drawing-room, he struck her, intending only to render her senseless, until he had secured the booty. Mr. Hannaford completely recovered, and in his right mind was in due time released from Broadmoor. The letter from his mother to Dorcas Dean, thanking her for clearing her son's character and proving his innocence of the terrible crime for which he had been practically condemned, brought tears to my eyes as Dorcas read it aloud to Paul and myself. It was touching and beautiful to a degree. As she folded it up and put it away, I saw that Dorcas herself was deeply moved. "These are the rewards for my profession," she said. "They compensate for everything." The end.